I thought I'd finally earned something from my parents, the car they'd been promising me for years. Instead, they handed it over to my golden brother like I was never even in the running. I smiled, congratulated him, and quietly started working on a plan. It wasn't about the car anymore. It was about finally proving I wasn't the family's doormat. And when the day came, I made sure he wouldn't be driving that car, or any car, ever again. Growing up, my family operated on an unspoken hierarchy. At the top was my younger brother, the golden child. It wasn't even subtle. Every achievement of his was celebrated like a national holiday. Every mistake brushed off as just part of growing up. Me? I was the reliable one. The one who didn't need as much attention, because I could handle it. I told myself it didn't bother me. I even believed it for a while. But there were moments, quiet, ugly moments, where it did. Like when my brother quit his part-time job after 2 weeks and my parents applauded him for focusing on school. Meanwhile, when I asked to cut back my hours to study for finals, I got a lecture about responsibility. Still, I learned to keep my head down. I worked, I saved, I did my own laundry while my brother somehow forgot how to turn on the washing machine. And through all of it, I clung to one promise my parents had made to me since I was 16. When you get your license, the car is yours. It was a modest goal, but to me, that car meant more than 4 wheels and an engine. It meant independence. I could drive to work instead of biking 5 miles in the rain. I could visit friends without begging for rides. I could stop scheduling my life around whoever was available to pick me up. Over the years, they talked about it casually, like it was a given. My dad would say things like, "We'll keep the car in the family for you," and my mom would add, "Just take care of it, and it'll last you years." It became a little light at the end of the tunnel, something concrete to look forward to. I wasn't naive. I knew my parents had a soft spot for my brother, but I also believed in fairness. This was supposed to be my turn, my moment. I'd put in the work, been patient, and played by their rules. Then, about a month before my license renewal, I noticed a change. My parents grew vague whenever I mentioned the car. My brother started making offhand comments about how nice it'll be to have his own ride. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he meant eventually, after I'd used it. But that uneasy feeling didn't go away. And it wasn't just the words, it was the way they avoided eye contact when I brought it up. Like there was something they didn't want to say. The tipping point came one evening at dinner. Mom smiled too brightly, Dad avoided my gaze, and my brother was practically vibrating in his seat. I didn't know it yet, but everything I thought I could count on in my family was about to shift. Little did I know, that dinner was just the warm-up for a betrayal years in the making. I'd been counting down the weeks, not because of my birthday or some big life event, but because my parents had been dropping hints for months. When you get your license, we'll finally pass down the car. The car wasn't fancy, a decade-old silver sedan with a dent on the passenger side and a radio that only picked up half the stations. But to me, it meant independence. No more begging for rides. No more timing my life around my brother's schedule. No more watching my friends drive off while I stood in the driveway. That night, the whole family was at the dinner table. It was one of those awkwardly cheerful meals where everyone smiles too much. Mom made lasagna, my favorite, but I barely touched it. Dad kept glancing at my brother, who was grinning like he'd already won something. Finally, Mom cleared her throat. "So, we've been talking," she said, in that tone that meant decisions have been made without you. "Your father, and I think it makes the most sense for the car to go to your brother." At first, I thought she meant go to, as in let him borrow it sometimes. But no, the words hit me like a slow-motion punch. "To keep," Dad added, almost apologetically, but not enough to look me in the eyes. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to process it any other way. "You mean the car you've been telling me for years would be mine?" Dad sighed. "You're busy with work. He'll need it for school, and, well, you'll get your turn." My turn? Like I was a kid at the back of a carnival line, waiting for a ride that might never come. My brother shrugged with faux humility. "It's just a car. Don't make it a big deal." The rest of the meal blurred. I remember pushing food around my plate, the clink of silverware, the sound of my brother texting under the table. My parents moved on to lighter topics, acting as if nothing earth-shattering had just happened. But inside, something shifted. Not just disappointment, a cold, focused kind of clarity. They'd picked their favorite yet again, and I wasn't even worth a real explanation. That should have been the end of it. I could have sulked, saved up, and bought my own car in a year or two. But as I sat there, pretending to listen to Dad's story about a neighbor's new lawnmower, my brother's smirk kept catching my eye. It wasn't gratitude, it was victory. And that's when it stopped being about a car. It became about making sure that victory didn't last. But that was just the beginning of my nightmare. 2 days after the family dinner, I heard the sound of the sedan's engine outside my window. It was late morning, and I was still in my work clothes from the night before, trying to catch up on sleep. But that engine had a way of making my stomach tighten now. I peeked through the blinds. My brother was leaning against the hood, sunglasses on, texting with one hand while holding an iced coffee in the other. He wasn't driving to school. It was Saturday. He wasn't heading to work. He didn't have one. 10 minutes later, I heard the screech of tires as he pulled out. Not carefully backing down the driveway, more like peeling out of a drag race. I felt my jaw tighten. That was supposed to be my car, the one I'd promised myself I'd take care of. Over the next week, little details started stacking up. I'd find fast food wrappers in the trash with receipts timestamped at 2 a.m. I'd notice the faint smell of cigarette smoke drifting in through my bedroom window when he parked. One morning, I even saw a parking ticket sticking out from under the windshield wiper before he yanked it off and shoved it into his backpack. I wanted to believe maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just the sting of losing something I thought was mine. But then I overheard him talking to his friend on speakerphone. "Yeah, man, I've already got 3 warning notices from the insurance. But whatever, my parents will handle it." 3 warnings. And he didn't sound worried. He sounded amused. That night at dinner, I tried testing the waters. "So, how's the car?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Mom smiled. "Oh, he's doing great with it, aren't you?" My brother grinned and took another bite of his burger without answering. That smile made my skin crawl. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smug curve you get when you know someone can't touch you. I started paying closer attention. One evening, I caught a glimpse of his phone screen as he set it down. A text from his friend read, "If you get caught again, you're done. They'll suspend your license." Done. Suspended license. The words looped in my head long after he'd left the room. By the end of that week, I'd pieced together more than I wanted to know. He was driving without keeping up his insurance payments. He'd been pulled over at least twice. He was ignoring notices and assuming our parents would cover for him. And the worst part? They probably would. I could have confronted him right then, but I didn't. Something told me it wasn't the right time. I needed more than just my suspicions. I needed something solid. Undeniable proof that even our parents couldn't sweep under the rug. That proof came sooner than I expected. Then I found something that confirmed my worst fears. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was coming home from work, still in my uniform, when I saw the car parked halfway onto the curb in front of the house. One headlight was out, and there was a fresh scrape running down the driver's side door. My first thought was, maybe he clipped a trash can. My second thought was, no way he's going to admit it. I walked past the car slowly, pretending to check my phone, and that's when I noticed the envelope on the passenger seat. The big, bold red letters said final notice. I don't know if it was adrenaline or just years of being overlooked, but I didn't hesitate. I opened the passenger door and grabbed the envelope. The wind carried the faint smell of stale fries and cologne as I pulled it out. Inside was a letter from the insurance company, dated 2 weeks ago. His policy had been officially canceled. The reason? Non-payment. And not just for 1 month, for 4. I stood there, reading the same line over and over. This vehicle is not currently insured for operation on public roads. That's when my pulse started pounding in my ears. He wasn't just careless, he was reckless, and my parents had either missed it entirely or, worse, ignored it. I tucked the letter under my arm and headed inside. My brother was on the couch, shoes kicked off, playing video games like the outside world didn't exist. "Hey," I said casually. "You know your insurance is canceled, right?" He didn't even look up. "Yeah, Mom and Dad will fix it." That flat, arrogant tone snapped something in me. Do they even know? Now he looked at me, smirking. Why would I tell them? They'd just freak out. Besides, it's not like they'll take the car away. Who else would they give it to? There it was, the open, unshakable belief that he was untouchable. That no matter what he did, there'd be no consequences. I didn't argue. I just walked past him to my room, shut the door, and sat on my bed with the letter spread out in front of me. The anger was hot and sharp, but under it was something colder, a kind of satisfaction. This was the undeniable proof I'd been waiting for. The scrape on the car, the missing headlight, the unpaid insurance. It was all stacking up. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt like I wasn't powerless. Because now I had a choice. I could keep this to myself and let him dig his own grave, or I could make sure the ground gave way exactly when I wanted it to. I wasn't ready for what I was about to discover. The letter from the insurance company sat in my desk drawer for 3 days. Every time I opened it, that bright red final notice seemed to glare at me, like it was daring me to use it. On the 4th day, I decided to do a little digging. I wasn't about to make a move without knowing exactly where all the pressure points were. If I was going to knock the golden child off his pedestal, I needed to know how the whole pedestal was built. I started with the state's online DMV portal. All I needed was the plate number, easy enough to get, since the car was parked in our driveway half the time. I typed it in, expecting to see my brother listed as the registered owner. He wasn't. The registration was still in my parents' names. My eyes narrowed. That meant, legally, my brother didn't own the car. He was driving it under their insurance, or at least he had been, before he decided not to pay. If anything serious happened, the fallout would land directly on them. That was interesting. Curiosity pushed me further. I checked the title history, which showed no transfer had ever been filed. The car was technically still just in the family, not in my brother's possession. He was acting like it was his personal property, but on paper, he had no more right to it than I did. And then came the kicker. In the state records, I saw a note about an unpaid parking violation. Not the ticket I'd spotted earlier, but a different one. The fine had doubled after 30 days of non-payment, and it was still outstanding. The notice had been sent to my parents' address last week. I sat back in my chair, connecting the dots. My parents might know more than they were letting on. Or maybe they hadn't opened the mail yet. Either way, this was more than just a lazy, entitled brother with a car he didn't deserve. This was liability. And if there was one thing my parents cared about more than my brother's feelings, it was their own financial safety. Later that evening, I tested the waters again. I mentioned to my mom in passing, "Funny thing, I saw the car still registered under you and Dad." She froze for a split second before forcing a smile. "Well, yes, technically. But it's his car to use now. To use, not to own." The choice of words told me everything. They'd set this up so they could yank it back if they needed to. They just hadn't found a reason big enough. Yet, that night, lying in bed, I thought about the smug way my brother had said, who else would they give it to? And I realized something. I didn't have to wait for him to wreck the car or rack up more tickets. I already had the leverage. I just had to pick the right moment to make it matter. This went so much deeper than I thought. The realization that I already had leverage sat in my mind like a loaded weapon. On paper, my brother had no legal claim to the car. The insurance was gone, the violations were stacking up, and the registration still belonged to my parents. But leverage only works if you use it at the right time, and using it too soon could blow the whole thing. Part of me wanted to storm into the living room that night, drop the insurance letter and DMV records onto the coffee table, and watch the smug drain from his face. I imagined the sputtering, the backpedaling, the moment he realized he wasn't untouchable. But the other part of me knew better. If I showed my cards now, my parents might just bail him out before any real consequences hit. They'd pay the fines, reinstate the insurance, and hand him the keys like nothing happened. And I'd be left looking petty. So I waited. I watched. I made mental notes of every new dent, every late-night return, every crumpled piece of paper he tried to shove into his backpack before anyone noticed. Meanwhile, I started researching. I read up on state laws for uninsured driving, how liability worked when the registered owner wasn't the driver, what violations could trigger a license suspension. I even called a friend who worked at a local auto shop and asked a few hypothetical questions about what happens when a car fails certain inspections. The more I learned, the more a plan began to take shape. It wasn't going to be loud or explosive, no screaming matches or dramatic key snatching in the driveway. No, this was going to be quiet, surgical, and irreversible. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a war going on in my head. There were nights I'd lie awake thinking, maybe this is too much. Maybe I should just let it go. Then I'd remember the look on his face at that dinner table, that victorious smirk, and the doubt would evaporate. I also thought about the risk. If this blew back on me, my parents could cut me off completely. Not financially. I'd been independent for years, but emotionally. This was the kind of move you don't come back from in a family like mine. Still, the scales tipped every time I saw him treat the car like a disposable toy. Every time I caught a glimpse of the arrogance in his eyes, the The certainty that no matter what he did, the safety net would always be there. It wasn't about the car anymore. It was about ending that certainty. About showing him and my parents that choices have consequences, and sometimes those consequences arrive wearing a smile. By the end of the week, I knew exactly what I was going to do. All I had to do was wait for the right trigger, the one moment that would make my actions seem like nothing more than the natural result of his own behavior. And when that moment came, I would be ready. I spent sleepless nights planning. Finally, I knew what I had to do. The trigger moment arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I came home early from work and found my brother pacing in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear. He didn't notice me at first. "Yeah, I know, but I can't pay it right now," he was saying, his voice sharp with irritation. "Just extend it or something. My parents will cover it." I leaned casually against the doorway. "Another bill you're ignoring?" He shot me a glare. "Mind your business." But it wasn't just a bill. I could see the paper on the counter. It was a vehicle inspection notice with a bold deadline. Failure to comply may result in registration suspension. And the deadline was tomorrow. That was my opening. I picked up the paper, pretending to read it with mild curiosity. "You know, if you want, I can take the car in for you. I'm off tomorrow." He blinked, thrown off by the offer. "Why would you do that?" I shrugged. "Because Mom and Dad will freak if they get another letter in the mail. I'll save you the lecture." It was just enough logic to make him agree. "Fine. Keys are in my room." The next morning, I drove the car to a shop I'd already scoped out, a place my friend from the auto industry had tipped me off about. I didn't ask them to fail the car. I didn't have to. The sedan already had more problems than my brother would ever admit. Bald tires, brake pads worn to the metal, a cracked windshield. When the mechanic handed me the failed inspection sheet, I made sure to get 2 copies. One for the DMV, one for me. I returned the car to the driveway like nothing happened. By the time my brother asked, "So, how'd it go?" I just handed him the paper and said, "Yeah, you're going to need to fix a few things before it passes." He skimmed it, frowned, and tossed it onto his desk. "Whatever. I'll get to it." And that was the beauty of it. I knew he wouldn't. For the next 2 weeks, I watched the clock. The DMV deadline came and went. No repairs, no inspection, which meant the car's registration was officially suspended. And with no insurance, no inspection, and no legal registration, my brother's beloved status symbol had just become a driveway ornament. The first time I saw him realize it, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He came storming into the kitchen, waving a letter. "They suspended the registration. I can't even drive it." I kept my expression neutral. "Wow, that sucks." He slammed the letter down, muttering curses under his breath, then disappeared into his room. For the next few days, the car sat untouched. My parents were unusually quiet about it, probably hoping it would just resolve itself. And I let them believe that, for now. Because as far as they knew, this was just a temporary setback. As far as I knew, this was only phase 1. I thought it was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. I thought my part was done. The registration was suspended, the car was grounded, and my brother had no way of fixing it without pouring money into repairs he couldn't afford. I figured the worst that could happen now was a few weeks of him sulking around the house. I underestimated his stupidity. One Saturday morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard that familiar engine rumble to life. My first thought was, no, he wouldn't. But when I glanced out the window, there he was, backing down the driveway like nothing had changed. By the time I ran outside, he was already halfway down the street. It wasn't just reckless, it was begging for disaster. Driving with a suspended registration, no insurance, and a failed inspection? If he got pulled over, the fines alone would be brutal. And if anything happened, my parents, as the registered owners, would take the legal hit. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was my mom. "Where's your brother?" she asked, voice tight. I hesitated. "Out." "What?" There was a pause. "We just got a call from the police. Turns out, he hadn't made it far before he was pulled over. No valid registration. No insurance. Expired inspection. And, because fate apparently decided to pile on, a broken taillight. The officer had the car towed on the spot. When my parents came home from the impound lot, they looked different. My dad's face was pale, my mom's lips pressed into a thin line. My brother, on the other hand, stormed in like he'd been personally wronged. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, slamming his bag down. "They can't just take my car." Dad snapped, really snapped, for the first time in years. It's not your car. It's ours. And you've just cost us hundreds of dollars in fines. That was new, hearing my dad say the quiet part out loud. But then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. My parents decided to pause my brother's use of the car until he earned back their trust, which sounded great, until they started hinting that maybe I could use the car in the meantime, if I helped them pay for the repairs. On the surface, it was everything I'd wanted. But there was a problem. If I took the car now, I'd inherit all the baggage, the fines, the tickets, the bad history. And if my brother thought for even a second that I'd benefited from his downfall, he'd turn the family Cold War into an all-out battle. I realized the game wasn't over. The stakes had just shifted. I didn't just want access to the car. I wanted to end the pattern, the automatic favoritism, the get-out-of-jail-free cards, the assumption that I'd always be second place. This wasn't about driving anymore. This was about finally tipping the scales in my favor, permanently. What happened next made me question everything. The shift in my parents' tone didn't last long. For about a week, they kept the car keys locked away and spoke to my brother in clipped sentences. I thought maybe, just maybe, this was the turning point, the moment they'd finally see him for who he really was. Then came Sunday dinner. The four of us sat at the table, the car situation hanging unspoken in the air. I was halfway through my plate when Mom said, "We've been talking, and we think it's time to give your brother another chance." I froze, fork hovering midair. Another chance? It's been 6 days. Dad cleared his throat. "We're not saying everything's fine, but he's learned his lesson." I almost laughed. Learned his lesson? He drove illegally, got the car impounded, and cost you hundreds of dollars. What lesson is that? How to get away with it faster next time. My brother leaned back, smirking, like this was a debate he'd already won. "You're just mad because you didn't get the car." And that hit me harder than it should have. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was exactly the narrative my parents would believe if they wanted to excuse him again. I was just bitter, petty, and jealous. I realized in that moment that I wasn't winning, I was losing. If they handed him the keys again, all my careful work would unravel. The failed inspection, the suspended registration, the impound. It would all fade into a family story about that rough patch he went through. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I felt genuinely cornered. I'd been playing the long game, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the hammer, and somehow the hammer was slipping out of my hands. And the worst part? A small, treacherous part of me wondered if I was becoming the villain. I'd engineered situations, withheld information, and set traps, all while telling myself it was justice. But lying there in the dark, I couldn't shake the question, what if I'd gone too far? The next day, my parents called a family meeting. I knew what was coming before they even started talking. Dad announced they'd decided to pay off the fines, reinstate the registration, and fix the car so it could be useful again. And, of course, my brother would be the one driving it, with stricter rules this time. Something broke inside me. Weeks of planning, months of biting my tongue, all so they could hand him the victory like nothing had happened. I barely heard the rest of the conversation. My brother was already talking about where he'd drive first. My parents were nodding along. And I was sitting there, staring at my hands, feeling the weight of every time I'd swallowed my pride in this house. By the time the meeting ended, I knew two things. 1, if I didn't act now, I'd never get another chance. 2, whatever I did next had to be final. I realized what I had to do to end this once and for all. The family meeting had been on Sunday. By Monday morning, I was done waiting. If they were going to hand my brother the keys again, then I'd make sure those keys didn't unlock anything he could use. I started with the paperwork. The registration was still under my parents' names. I knew that from my DMV search. That meant they could revoke his right to drive it at any time, if they believed keeping it in his hands was too risky. All I had to do was prove, beyond doubt, that giving it back to him would be financial suicide. So I made copies. The failed inspection, the insurance cancellation notice, the unpaid parking tickets. I stacked them neatly in a folder, then added one final piece, the towing invoice from the impound lot, which I'd quietly taken from the pile of mail on the counter. That night, I waited until my parents were both in the living room. My brother was out, probably celebrating his win before he'd even officially gotten the car back. Perfect. I walked in, folder in hand. "Before you finalize your decision, you should see this." Dad frowned as I handed him the folder. Mom took the seat next to him, peering over his shoulder as he flipped through the pages. With each sheet, their expressions tightened. By the time they got to the impound bill, Mom was rubbing her forehead like she had a headache. "This is everything that's happened in the last 3 months," I said, my voice steady. "And if you give him the car back, you're not just rewarding him. You're putting yourselves on the hook for whatever happens next. If he hits someone, if he totals it, if he racks up more fines, it all comes back to you. Legally, financially." For once, there was no immediate pushback. "No, you're overreacting," or "he's just young." Just silence. Then Mom spoke. "Why didn't you bring this to us sooner?" I looked her straight in the eye. "Because you wouldn't have listened. You never do. Not when it's him." The room went very still. Dad closed the folder and set it on the coffee table. "We'll think about it." But I knew the decision was already made. 2 days later, my brother came home to find the driveway empty. The car was gone. My parents had sold it to a neighbor's cousin for cash. The look on his face when they told him was indescribable. Confusion, anger, disbelief, all colliding at once. "You can't just sell my car," he shouted. Dad's voice was calm. "It was never your car. And you proved you can't handle having one." For the first time in years, there was no negotiation, no coddling. Just a closed door on the conversation. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The victory wasn't in taking the car from him. It was in watching the unshakable certainty drain out of him, the realization that the rules didn't bend for him anymore. That night, as I heard him stomping around his room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time in this house: balance. And that was the day the golden shine finally wore off. In the days after the sale, the house felt different. Not peaceful exactly, my brother made sure of that, but quieter in a way that mattered. The constant hum of the car engine outside my window was gone. So were the late-night arrivals, the fast food bags in the trash, the smug glances over dinner. My brother barely spoke to me, which suited me fine. The few times we crossed paths, he'd mutter something under his breath about backstabbers or traitors, but it didn't land. I didn't feel guilty. Not once. My parents, though, they were complicated. They didn't apologize. That wasn't their style, but I noticed subtle shifts. Dad started asking me about my week without turning the conversation toward my brother. Mom invited me to run errands with her, just the two of us, like she used to before the family dynamic tilted in his favor. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. The car itself became a kind of ghost story. My brother would bring it up now and then, trying to spark an argument, but my parents shut it down every time. "It's done," they'd say. "Move on." And the fact that they didn't cave to him, not once, was the real victory. I'd like to say this whole thing brought us closer as a family, but that would be a lie. The truth is, some fractures don't heal. What it did do was change the balance. My brother learned, maybe for the first time in his life, that there are consequences even his golden child status can't shield him from. And my parents learned that I'm not the passive, easy-to-overlook kid they'd gotten used to. As for me, I moved on. I bought my own car a few months later. Nothing flashy, but brand new, fully insured, and entirely mine. Every time I slide behind the wheel, I feel that quiet satisfaction of knowing I earned it without anyone's permission. Sometimes I still catch my brother watching me when I leave the driveway. There's no smirk now, just something unreadable in his eyes. Maybe resentment. Maybe the dawning realization that his safety net isn't as solid as he thought. And that's enough for me. I don't need an apology. I don't need him to admit I was right. The look on his face the day he realized the car was gone, that's the memory I keep. That's the closure. People like to say revenge doesn't solve anything. Maybe they're right, if your goal is forgiveness or reconciliation. But if your goal is balance, if your goal is to stop being the family's afterthought, then sometimes the only way forward is to make sure the scales tip, and tip hard. That's what I did. And I'd do it again. You know, people always tell you to just let it go when family plays favorites. But what they don't understand is that letting it go often means letting it happen again and again, until it's not just about the thing you lost, but about the person you become in the process. This story wasn't about a car. It was about years of being told, in 100 small ways, that I'd always come second. That my effort, my patience, and my responsibility meant less than someone else's carelessness, simply because of who they were. Taking that car away from my brother didn't make me rich, didn't make me famous, and it sure didn't make us closer. But it did something far more important. It proved that the rules can change, even in a family that's convinced they're set in stone. So if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or flat out dismissed, remember, you don't have to wait for permission to balance the scales. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. We're just getting started.